And thank you, Justin, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Melba Pearson. I'm proud to serve as one of the co-chairs of the Prosecution Function Committee, one of the vice chairs on council, and just happy to be part of the criminal justice section of the ABA. So our discussion today is going to be centered around voter suppression or voter fraud. And the timing, of course, could not be better based on all that we're seeing, especially the fact that Fox and Dominion settled, but that's another discussion for another day. So in terms of this panel, as election years, we often hear the phrase, vote as if your life depends on it. Approximately 4.6 million people in the United States, however, cannot vote, even if their lives, liberties, families do depend on these elections. As reported by the Sentencing Project, 48 states ban people from voting if they have a criminal conviction. Furthermore, people must go through a disenfranchisement maze to restore their voting rights. If their state laws do not ban them completely from voting permanently, then they would have to go through that process. Across the country, states have used claims of voter fraud to impose restrictive voting laws and prosecute people who register to vote or votes when ineligible because of these convictions. From Florida, yes, my home state rises again. From Florida to Texas to Tennessee and beyond, most Black and brown community members who are predominantly women have been arrested for voting. This panel will discuss how the disenfranchisement maze leads to confusion and opens people up to potential prosecution, especially members of the Black and Latinx communities. It will consider the use of the prosecutorial discretion and decisions to file charges, and panelists will also discuss the statutory and litigation trends around these types of cases. So we're going to start off with introductions. And basically, I'm just going to name the person and their position, and then we'll go back around and have them do self-introductions because I do feel that people can tell more about their story than me reading a bio. So directly next to me is Demetria Frank, visiting her chair of excellence and professor, University of Memphis, Cecil C. Humphrey School of Law, located here in Memphis. Next is Nicole D. Porter, Senior Director of Advocacy of the Sentencing Project in Washington, D.C. Wayne McKenzie, General Counsel for the New York City Department of Corporation in New York. And last but certainly not least, Camila Turner, who is an attorney at Turner Law Firm here in Memphis. So starting off, and they have all agreed that I may call them by their first names. So Demetria, we will start with you with your self-introduction.
So why did the person with the felon cross the road? To get to the polling location, only to find out they had to go pay a bunch of fees, go through a very lengthy petition process to have their votes recognized. So I know that wasn't the punchline you hoped for. But I think that the thing, well, first off, I'm Demetria, as was already stated. I am a professor at the University of Memphis. My expertise in this area comes from teaching a course in mass incarceration. And I think with my students, the first thing that we have to kind of gravitate in the classes, all these misconceptions they have about the criminal justice system. And so I'm really glad to be here and talk to you all because I think that there's a gap in what prosecutors do, what defense attorneys do, and then what the public does. So I appreciate the invitation and look forward to this discussion.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be on a panel with all of you, and I'm really encouraged that the ABA is having this conversation because 2024 is coming. I'm Nicole with the Sentencing Project, Senior Director of Advocacy there. We do research the estimates around who is impacted by felony disenfranchising laws come from the Sentencing Project and our long-term research partners out of the University of Minnesota, Chris Eugen, who has trailblazed and refined the methodology to generate the national estimates and state-specific estimates as well. And then Synesthesia Project is a research-informed advocacy organization, so we are national partners to state and local campaigns working to expand the franchise and then also to guarantee ballot access for those who are legally eligible to vote, either in criminal custody, those who are pretrial in jail, also those who are in secure facilities. In recent years, Washington, D.C., where I live, actually expanded the franchise, ended felony disenfranchisement for people sentenced to prison with felony convictions, joining the jurisdictions of Puerto Rico and the 2 states of Maine and Vermont, which never took away people's voting rights even when sentenced to prison. Puerto Rico expanded the franchise in the early 80s. So I think where the movement is right now is continuing to actively work to expand voting rights to people who are currently disenfranchised. And this year there have been big wins out of Minnesota, New Mexico, which we can get into. And then also supporting the infrastructure necessary to guarantee ballot access. And given the context of this panel, getting ready for the defensive work that needs to happen, because that is happening. I mean, we are in a backlash era right now. The progress that's been made since the civil rights era is being rolled back. New restrictions are put in place, and actually efforts are being put in place to weaponize progressive policies, putting at risk the most marginalized residents among us. So I'm so happy that a legal services organization, a legal organization is having this conversation, because I think there's all sorts of legal infrastructure that could be set up in preparation for 2024, and look forward to offering some of those suggestions.
Good morning. Well, other than being the thorn amongst the roses, Wayne McKenzie, I am the immediate past chair of the criminal justice section, and for the next, I guess, 4 weeks, general counsel of the Department of Probation before I move on. Part of, well, first of all, I think New York is fairly progressive when you talk about disenfranchisement and voting rights. And part of what I do very actively in my agency with probation is we're very, very, very intentional about educating and actually registering individuals on probation to vote. Because unfortunately what we find is a lot of folks just assume they've got a felony conviction, they can't vote. And in the state of New York, that's not accurate. So we're really active in that regard. So I sort of looking forward to this conversation and hearing what my fellow panelists have to say on this subject.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Camila Turner, and most recently, I am a juvenile defender. I represent children in Shelby County accused of crimes through the Shelby County Public Defender's Office. And about 10 years ago, I started volunteering to help people in Tennessee get their voting rights restored. Tennessee is the worst state, probably next to Florida. They may be tied for the absolute worst states when it comes to ex-felons trying to get their voting rights restored. I realized that it was extremely complicated, that people were not informed, they were not educated, and that lawyers and judges were also confused about how people in Tennessee can get their voting rights restored. So I started volunteering to walk people through the process, to go to court with them, to file the petitions, and then getting other lawyers to do the same thing, training other lawyers on how to do it, and encouraging lawyers to offer that as a service to their clients. And as you just stated, a lot of people don't even know that they can get their voting rights restored. So I see this as a civil rights issue. My family was involved in the civil rights movement. My mother and aunts were helped to integrate the city of Memphis. My oldest aunt, who just turned 87, was one of the first students arrested in the city of Memphis for sitting in. And so I feel like this is part of my legacy and my duty, and I'm glad to be on this panel.
Thank you for that. And so I'm going to stay with you for a second, Camilla, because both you and Wayne sort of touched on some of the misconceptions that are often held by people with felony convictions, not thinking that they can go ahead and register to vote. What are some of the other misconceptions that are swirling around when it comes to, disenfranchisement and voting, not only within the returning citizens community, but more broadly, maybe by the public as a whole? And do those misconceptions play a role in why sometimes it's so difficult for people with felony convictions to be able to get the correct information and be able to exercise their right to vote?
Yes, I feel like what I found is that there is a lot of shame around having a felony conviction. And a lot of times people haven't even told the people close to them that they have a felony conviction. The people at their church don't know. Sometimes their family members don't know. And so it's very difficult to reach out to get help, because you have to go to a clinic and stand in a line and tell somebody, 20 years ago this happened, 30 years ago this happened, and I would like to get my voting rights restored. But the main misconception is that it can't happen. And then in Tennessee, even lawyers are confused about the process. Judges are confused about the process. We saw recently a woman was sentenced to 6 years in prison right here in Shelby County, right here in Memphis, because she attempted to register to vote. She didn't even vote. But the fact that she tried to register and her probation officer told her she could register, and so there's a lot of confusion. I think that the process needs to be simplified. There's so many challenges, especially in the state of Tennessee. For instance, if someone has a felony conviction and they're trying to get their voting rights restored, if they are behind in their child support, they can't have their voting rights restored in Tennessee, and there's nothing you can do about it. Even if they are making payments, even if they're on a payment plan, you still can't get your voting rights restored, and that's exclusive to the state of Tennessee, and it was put in place to keep people from being able to register to vote. So I think that certainly the laws need to change, lawyers need to be educated, and the general public needs to embrace people who are having these challenges and let them know that there is help for them.
Absolutely. Nicole, Demetria, Wayne, other thoughts on misconceptions that are held by people within the returning citizens community, as well as the public at large, in terms of being able to vote after having a felony conviction?
I mean, I'll just add that the laws have changed and towards progress, but they've also regressed, which is one contributing factor to why the laws are so confusing, and that even practitioners can be confused and present improper information. And I think there's an increasing risk at marginalized residents getting that information, acting upon it, and then being at risk of criminalization, being arrested for voter fraud cases. That was the reality in Florida, where it was actually election officials post Amendment 4 that went into the jails, went into marginalized communities, registered or encouraged people to register who had prior felony convictions, and they themselves apparently weren't clear on what the ballot measure did, which it did in post-sentence disenfranchisement for most offenses. But the offenses of people are still disenfranchised after they've completed their sentence if they have a conviction, a murder conviction or a sex offense conviction. And apparently the specifics of the reform weren't mentioned to those being registered. And the 20 people who were arrested last August made the national news. You all may remember the news report that came out as a part of the Florida Election Integrity Unit, were confused as to why they were being arrested, and it literally looked like a roundup from a bygone era. And I think that where we are right now, given the backlash politics that are permeating many states in the country, not just Florida, not just Tennessee, I think it was Pamela Moses that you were referencing. I mean, but this is, people are at risk, given the makeup of state legislatures, given, I think, a window of time that conservative-led legislatures are trying to leverage to, I think, I'm sure, a minority rule, given the predicted shift in demographics that the country is moving towards by 2050, or whatever the timeline is when there would be a majority electorate of color, that given shifts in the demographics. So I think these election integrity units, of which people with felony convictions will be at most risk of arrest, prosecution, and potential incarceration, is something not just in Tennessee, but throughout the country, particularly in states in the South, I would say. So it's something for us to look at and figure out ways to counteract in developing the legal infrastructure, including defense programs, bail funds, and a range of other sort of practices to put in place so that people most at risk of these criminalizations can get the support that they need.
I think one public misconception is that disenfranchisement only impacts people who are currently in prison, which obviously people who have felonies have that misconception as well. Why do they go out and vote? The other thing I think is that how common these voter fraud cases are. I think we kind of wait on the media to tell us when these things are happening, but they happen a lot more frequently than the media reports, in part because of the shame issue that Attorney Turner brought up. I have a friend who is a defense attorney in Dallas who had a client who had been in some trouble before, was out, and when he went to get his driver's license, which he used a third party to kind of help him along with that process, but when he went to get his driver's license, there was a question on the form that asked, do you want to register to vote? And when he sent that form in, or provided that paperwork, he got a summons to appear in court as a violation of his parole. So this is not something that went to the media because, as noted, people are ashamed, so they don't necessarily want the media to know that they're going through this process. And so that just set a light bulb off to me. Like, how often is this happening? Where people are making innocent moves and potentially face these criminal penalties. I think it happens probably a lot more than the public or in attorneys and anyone really realizes. So I think that's probably the thing I would say. It blew my mind. So.
And so, first of all, every comment that was just made in response to this question, Melba, is extremely valid. And so I guess the only thing I can add is also how irrational and confusing laws are as well. And as an example of that, let's assume that I was convicted of carrying an illegal firearm in the state of New York, and I was sentenced to probation. I could still vote. If I was convicted of exactly the same crime, I was sent to state prison, and now I'm released on parole. I can't vote until I'm off of parole for exactly the same crime. And so when you think about, my God, saying that you're checking off would you like to register to vote, that's insane, right? And so, yeah, the only thing I add, just the crazy, whether it's an intentional or just irrational laws just adds to the mix.
So in light of these arrests now that we're seeing and, you know, people getting summoned, the convictions, do you view this as a criminal legal system issue, or is this a civil rights issue? Both? And does that distinction matter in terms of how to move forward, how to address this issue?
I think it's both. The history of these laws, I mean, settler colonialists brought this practice to the U.S., to North America, even before the country was founded. But the expansion of these laws happened post-Reconstruction as Southern states reconstituted themselves after the Civil War. The history is clear that felony was used as a proxy for Black to intentionally disenfranchise and marginalize Black men from the electorate. 2023 is the 50th year of mass incarceration. 1973 is the first year that the prison population started to surge during the United States mass incarceration era. And the number of people disenfranchised has grown right along with that curve. So in the mid-70s, about 1 million people were locked out because of a felony conviction, locked out of the voting process because of a felony conviction. As of last fall, a little over 4.6 million were disenfranchised because of a felony conviction. And that's because of a range of cumulative practices that results in that disproportionality of Black and Latinx residents being disenfranchised from the system. So it's definitely an intersectional issue between democracy and the failures of democracy in the United States and the criminal legal system, given the disproportionate impact on Black communities in particular, because of who elites imagine to be Black with the growth of the criminal legal apparatus starting from the post-Reconstruction era.
Other thoughts?
I definitely think it's both. And one particular thing about the criminal system is what a poor job we do explaining to people who have committed felons what their rights are when they're released. And that is a systemic issue criminally and a systemic issue civilly, that I leave and have served my sentence and I'm not aware of it. That should not be the circumstance of any American to be in violation for innocent behavior. And so, as already stated, we also have this really disproportionate impact. And so let's talk about how this disenfranchises Black communities. So on a one-to-one basis, when we're talking about who's not being able to vote and who may sustain these criminal penalties, but I also think it's a broader civil rights issue, because now we're talking about how many people did you say? 4 million people, 4 million people are voting. That becomes a representation issue. That means that our legislators, the people who are getting elected, aren't being duly elected by the groups of people that need it, the representation that people end up with, groups of people end up with, that they may not be representative of them, because this is disproportionate. There's something, you can correct me if this statistic is wrong, that there's some states where up to 20% of the Black voter base is impacted. That's huge. That's a huge number of people, and we talk about taking all of those people out of the voting system, whether in prison or out. There are certainly voices that are being silenced, and so it's a criminal issue because of how we inform people and the penalties themselves, but it's also a individual civil rights issue, but even a broader civil rights issue that deals with representation.
So it's definitely also a civil rights issue. Anytime you put the label of felon on someone, you begin to take away all of these rights. Certainly the right to vote, the right to serve on a jury, the right to have access to federal grant money, the right to have access to public housing. And anytime you say you're a citizen because you are born in America and God bless America, but then you push all of these people to the margins, to the outskirts, then that's a serious civil rights issue that we have to deal with. And so that's why it's important that people be informed, and especially for lawyers, and I know we all know this, When you have cases and you're representing people, how can you prevent this person from being a convicted felon? You know, and I know it's difficult, especially when you represent poor people, because if someone is in jail and they've been in jail for a week, a month, a year, 2 years, and now they have a deal, even if the state's case, the government's case is completely weak, if you go to that person and you say, the prosecutor said you can get out of jail today if you plead to this felony, then they're gonna take the deal. They're gonna take the deal, and they're gonna be a convicted felon for the rest of their life in most cases. And so these are all the kinds of the challenges that we have to deal with in addressing what it means to make somebody a convicted felon. And why is there such a push to have so many people in our society who can't participate? You have children in school, but you can't vote on who's on the school board because you had a felony conviction 20 years ago. You know, so I think that we have to definitely change the narrative, erase the shame, and stop making so many people felons.
Putting my mic back on. So, Nicole, you already kind of touched a little bit on the history of voting disenfranchisement, that this was nothing brand new, right? But now we're seeing this rise of voter integrity units. You know, Florida being one, our new voter protection fraud, which how many millions of tax dollars, we don't even really know, is going towards this enforcement. And by the way, as a side note, of the 20-something people that got arrested for quote-unquote voter fraud, I believe there was only one conviction, that's because the person took a plea, and the rest of them, most of those other cases have been dismissed because there was no legal basis. But is this type of organization, so in other words, the organization of these units, is that something new and alarming, or was it just done differently? You know, is this just a 2.0 in other words? How was it handled in the past compared to how is it being handled today?
I think more research is going to need to be done to understand sort of the expansion of these integrity units, the growth of this practice, I think amongst voter suppressive ideologues. But certainly there are state elected officials from Texas to Florida who I think want to score points nationally. Maybe they have national political ambitions. Since 2020, they have used the authority of their office to establish these practices targeting marginalized residents. I was digging in my bag because I wanted to pull out the Student Team Project's report that came out last fall called Locked Out 2022. Folks can find it online at our website. There's more studies that need to be done in terms of the impact of voter fraud cases, and particularly who is getting arrested and charged and sentenced. But I will say that in this report, we looked at Minnesota in particular, and in the period over 5 election cycles from 2000 to 2019, only 243 people were convicted of voting while ineligible. This is in Minnesota specifically. And 134 individuals were convicted of registering while ineligible. So this is to demystify the assumption that voter fraud is rampant because of the rhetoric that has continued to dominate following the 2020 election cycle, and we need to be very mindful and watching how this rhetoric continues to influence the upcoming presidential election cycle. And I'll just continue to reinforce the people who are going to be most at risk at these voter integrity units are marginalized residents already with felony convictions, a majority or a disproportionate number of who are Black. And I think other communities of color are also at risk, including Latinx residents. But I do think, make no mistake about it, I think these policies, the root of them, following the post-Reconstruction era, are targeting Black residents in particular to undermine their representation in the electorate. And I think because of that anti-Blackness, other communities suffer, and so challenging anti-Blackness will help to increase opportunity and increase democratic representation for all communities around the country.
Thank you for that, Nicole. Other thoughts on the rise of this more organized voter integrity, and again, in quotes, voter integrity or voter protection type units rising in different states?
At the end of the day, it's not about protecting the integrity of the political process. Okay, it's about disempowering people of color. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for what? And so this is just a weaponization of the process.
You know, this makes me think of the last panel, right? That we're trying to solve a lot of our social problems by throwing more law enforcement into the equation, and that's an example of this. Like, we've got a problem, if we got a crime problem, or we got a voter integrity problem, I think that there are other ways to deal with that versus throwing more law enforcement and more tax dollars at that issue, right? So we looked at that and said, okay, where these places are popping up with throwing more law enforcement on top, why don't we take that money and spend that on voter education, on a session for people so that they understand what their rights are, right? It seems like that would be a preventative and better remedy versus arresting people on the back end. So I just think, you know, if I could cuss, I would call it something. But, it's already been said, this is not about protecting the integrity of the vote. It's about suppression. And so to answer the question of the panel, you know, we know the elephant in the room is about suppression, because if it wasn't about suppression, then they would be doing education on the front end versus just throwing more law enforcement at the issue.
And I would say, it's just a myth. It's not true that there are a lot of people trying to vote illegally. It's just not even happening. And the only thing that is happening as a result of that is that you are frightening people, scaring people from trying to get their voting rights restored. And so I think that it's a hoax. It's not anything that has any merit or value, and that it's a voter suppression tactic, like Professor Frank said, Frank said. Yeah.
And I think the numbers bear that out as well. If we looked nationally, I want to say it was like less than 5% of all the votes cast were fraudulent in one of the last elections, something very, very minuscule. So, you know, I think the data shows that this is not a real issue. But I wanted to pick up on something that you said, Demetria. You were talking about, you know, the role of enforcement and all of that. What role do you think, and this is just starting with you and then for the rest of the panel, what role do you think prosecutors and law enforcement should play in this process, using their discretion and using their offices to be able to address this issue, or is there even a role for them at all?
I think your question just answered the question, right? Why do we have law enforcement involved in this issue? My initial answer when this question came through was prosecutors need to make sure they are absolutely only prosecuting these cases when there is willful violation and a fraud, which, as we've already established, is very, very rare. So I just don't think we should be seeing these cases. We just shouldn't be seeing them. So that's my real answer, is that prosecutors really shouldn't have a role here. That this is a voter education issue more than likely with most cases, and that's the answer. Versus penalizing. And then why? I mean, I think it's already been alluded to by Attorney Turner. People who have felonies, their lives are hard enough. Their lives are hard enough. They've had every right stripped from them. They are trying to reintegrate into society. We're taking the one thing that gives them voice, or that could potentially give them voice, away. Right? And then we're going to prosecute them for trying to exercise that, for trying to be a citizen, for trying to do the right thing, for trying to be a voice in their communities, for all the things that got them to the very position where that they're in. And by the way, we need to hear from them if we're really convinced about crime or we're really concerned about it. We need them voting, right? They have the insider knowledge of what their circumstances. So why wouldn't you want those people voting if we're really talking democracy and we're talking about a system that we want to be better? Why would you exclude people who understand the process and the system and what they've been through and the circumstances that the community got? Why would you exclude them from the process if that's what it really is supposed to be about?
So I think there's a range of things that prosecutors and other legal practitioners can do. So I'll just focus on one, which is practice around reclassifying felonies to misdemeanors or low-level offenses so that the collateral impacts of felony convictions don't follow someone for the rest of their lives, particularly in states like Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, where voting and other collateral consequences are so extreme, even long after someone's completed their sentence. So there's a growing movement around progressive practices that prosecutors can establish. One could be revisiting a range of cases to reclassify them or lower the felony outcome to misdemeanor offenses so that those collateral impacts don't follow someone. So that's one thing specifically that prosecutors can do.
And so I think during my introduction, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be GC at probation for 4 more weeks, and then I'm returning to the field of prosecution. And as a prosecutor, me thinking or even wanting to waste my time on something like this, when the bigger issue is actually the apathy of individuals, right, who have the right to vote and are not exercising it, is a better use of my time. But I go back to what I said earlier. At the end of the day, this is not about protecting the integrity of the system. This is about suppressing the voices of Black and brown people.
Yes, so I said this earlier, but I'll say it again, it's not necessary to try to make so many people in the community convicted felons. And I think prosecutors have to be more creative and see it as something that's beneficial to the overall community. How are you benefiting the community by marginalizing people, by making sure that they won't be able to get a good job, that they can't participate in the political process, that they can't serve on a jury, that they can't be an executor of an estate, that they don't have access to federal funds for education and housing? How is that benefiting the community? How is that making the community safer? All you're doing is causing people to resort to desperate measures to take care of themselves and their families. So that's the one thing that they can certainly do. And also, when people come to court to try to get their voting rights restored, don't challenge it. You know, I've had prosecutors challenge, so in the state of Tennessee, in order to get your voting rights restored, you have to have paid your court costs. And if you haven't paid all your court costs, and court costs could be $20,000, $30,000, depending on whether you were in jail, how many times you went to court. And so, in order to get your voting rights restored, you have to go before a judge and basically say, I'm not able to pay this amount. Will you allow me to register to vote anyway? And so I've had prosecutors to challenge that. How does that benefit you? This person who is making, you know, $15 an hour and owes $30,000 in court costs, why would you have a challenge to that? To them being able to vote without having paid this amount. So I think, and we do have a new district attorney in Shelby County. I haven't had that challenge since he's been in office, but I think that prosecutors need to be on the same page when it comes to restoring people to citizenship. That this should be something that they're working just as vigorously towards as defense attorneys.
I know I already said something, but I also think we need to encourage prosecutors to think beyond the paper. right? We get into this day-to-day rote kind of way that we do our job, and we look at what's in, as artists, we need to be more creative and also think about the disproportionate impact of those actions. Right? It's bigger than that person's right to vote. It's bigger than those court fees. We're talking about entire communities who are silenced. And so I think also prosecutors should keep that in mind when pursuing things like that.
So starting to turn more towards solutions and strategies. Some of the strategies we've seen employed around the country include litigation, legislative advocacy, and maybe executive actions, depending on, from a gubernatorial level or some other, some parts, another branch of the executive. But what do you think is most effective of those that I've listed, if any? And sort of like, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using those tactics, and why?
I think that the laws have to change. I think that's the main thing. So in 2 states, Maine and Vermont, you don't lose the right to vote for a felony conviction. And then in some states, after you finish your sentence, your rights are automatically restored. Tennessee is the most restrictive state next to Florida, where unless you have paid your court costs, which, like I stated, can be exorbitant, you can't have your voting rights restored unless you have a hearing in front of a judge, and unless you are current on your child support. So all of these barriers are in place. And most of the time, when someone finds out that in order to get your voting rights restored, you have to go back to court. Because remember, it's usually a very traumatic experience for someone to go through the court process in the first place. So I had one man, he came to me and I said, yes, I can help you get your voting rights restored. We're gonna go to court, ask the judge to allow you to vote without having paid, this $15,000 you owe in court costs. He said, oh, no. I'm not going back in front of that man. Because he told me if he ever saw my face again, I was going to prison for the rest of my life. And so he didn't go. He was like, oh no, I didn't know I was gonna have to go and stand in front of that judge again. I'm not doing it. But, there are just so many barriers, but I think if the laws were changed, of course, ideally, why do you have to lose your right to vote? Because you have a felony conviction. And then, that's the main thing, the changing the laws. And there are other things that we can do too, but I think until the laws change, we're still gonna see disproportionate amounts of people who are not allowed to vote. And in Tennessee, is 21% of Black people cannot vote. That's 1 in 5 Black people in the state of Tennessee can't vote due to a felony conviction. And then there are a lot of white people too. There are 500,000 people in the state of Tennessee that can't vote due to a felony conviction. So we have to change the law.
And the reason why it's so important to change the law is because of the tendency to scale back when the change comes through another way. So in a state like Iowa and Virginia, governors issued executive orders to expand voting rights to people post-sentence. Those are 2 lifetime disenfranchising states, but the governors have expanded rights to people who've completed their sentence over the last couple of years. Well, currently, the current Virginia governor has actually scaled back the automatic rights restoration process. The process was first established by Republican Governor McDonnell in 2013, who sort of streamlined the application process. Then the 2 successive Democratic governors built on his process. At one point, Governor McAuliffe expanded the right to vote to some 173,000 people by trying to create an automatic process that re-enfranchised as many people as possible. That process was countered through litigation, and so it had to be scaled back to individual consideration. But then the governor who followed McAuliffe, Northam, actually expanded voting rights to people after incarceration, which means he reinstated rights for people in Virginia who are on probation and parole. But the current governor has moved the needle back on that, creating more process for people to apply to get their rights reinstated. And so the number as of 2022, under the current administration, was about 4,000 people got their rights reinstated in Virginia in 1 year, when like 600,000 people are released a year from Virginia jails and prisons. So it is important for the Constitution to change in states where a ballot measure needs to happen, and it's important for the statutory law to actually be changed so that if rights are expanded, they can't be taken away because of a new elected official who isn't friendly to democracy.
Other thoughts in terms of, let's say, the impact of litigation? Is that something that can be a good tool to be able to enfranchise more people, or?
I sort of think that that's probably the only tool, because when you think about the climate that we are in currently, there are actually more states becoming more restrictive, right? And so when you think about changing the laws, I guess it's like the brother in the last panel, like you should have come to me first, because it's from a view of pessimism. I have no confidence in the political process, and so I do think if there is going to be any movement, it's going to have to come through litigation.
I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach in answering because I just think that the civic engagement part is so crucial for people. There's research that shows that people who have their rights restored are less likely to reoffend. So this is also a recidivism issue, a reoffense issue, right? And so I think in the meantime, while we're waiting on the law to change, which probably isn't coming anytime soon,
States changed their laws this year. Almost 60,000 people got their votes back in Minnesota, New Mexico.
well, it ain't happening in Tennessee. So here in good old Tennessee, my encouragement is to try to find people other ways to be civically engaged because I think that civic engagement can be helpful for public safety. And really those people's voice need to be heard, as I said earlier. And so I tell people I'm from a crime family. So most of the men in my family have been felonized. And for the ones that have tried to sustain a active, civically engaged life, one thing that I've done with them is try to find other ways for them to be engaged. And then the other thing that I would say as an answer is, and I think I alluded to before, is for prosecutors and especially defense attorneys to help, right? Help them through that process. As attorney know that she gives her time freely to clients to help them do that. And I wish we had more attorneys doing that.
And can I just add, because of the civic engagement piece that you raised, there are activists who are actively working to expand voting rights in their states, even though they can't vote. So I have a longtime colleague in Texas. Texas is a state where you have to, you don't get your voting rights back until you're off paper, until you finish probation or parole, felony probation or parole. And a friend was released from prison in the early 90s and will not be released from parole until 2053. And he's in his late 50s. And that is not unusual. There needs to be more research done on the number of years people are required to serve parole and probation. And this is one of the driving factors that help change the law in Minnesota, is that Minnesota is a low incarceration state, but people are subjected to decades-long probation and parole terms in Minnesota. People can be on probation for like 45 years in Minnesota. So there were the leaders of efforts to change the laws in those states were people who couldn't vote. So they got their motivation to participate in their community, to change social policy in other ways, not by going to the ballot box because they're literally excluded from it, but by writing laws. The guy I just mentioned, he has actually written laws and testified on laws, but he can't vote on who represents him.
And you know what, I'm just thinking here, and another thing is that more justice impacted individuals actually in states where they can need to run for office.
Amen to that.
And I'm just as a point of, just as another data point, having gone through the Amendment 4 process in Florida, so for those who are not familiar, in 2018, we did have a ballot measure that passed with about 64% of Floridians voting in favor of second chances and restoring the rights to vote to people who are completed all the terms of their sentence, except for those who were convicted of homicide or sexual offenses. And while that was celebrated and all of that, the governor promptly directed the legislature to basically attack the ballot initiative process to make it harder to be able to put these types of initiatives on the ballot, so that future generations of voters can't make the changes that they wish to see. So that's just another thing to consider in terms of strategy, which I think speaks to a lot of what was discussed here about the fact that, yes, laws need to change, and we have to make sure it's codified in such a way that we don't end up, with a worse situation than we started out with. But I also wanted to touch on something, I believe it was you, Nicole, that mentioned this, but if I'm mistaken, my apologies. We had talked about how some states had moved towards, banning people from voting while incarcerated, but upon their release, they automatically get their rights to vote restored. Do we think that's a model that would address what we've been speaking about and the concerns we're speaking about, or is there a different model that we should be advocating for and holding up? And I open this up to everyone.
I think where the movement needs to go, and this Sentencing Project is actually actively supporting campaigns in Oregon and Illinois this year, is to end felony disenfranchisement outright, building on what was proved to be politically possible in the District of Columbia when people sentenced to prison and secure facilities were given the right to vote in 2020. When a state does it affirmatively, it'll, I think, help start a domino effect. I think the remaining 24 states that disenfranchise people on probation and parole are frankly will be politically challenging states, including Tennessee, as has already been hinted to. So I think what I'm motivated to do is try to open up space in the middle for states where rights restoration is what's next. Tennessee, Georgia, Texas. These are states where tens of thousands of individuals, hundreds of thousands of individuals are disenfranchised. So I hope by expanding the vote to people sentenced to secure facilities, guaranteeing the right to vote for people regardless of their incarceration status, that will open up a more middle space for rights restoration states to expand the vote to people in the community after incarceration. So I think that's where the movement can go, and I think this is happening right alongside of voter suppressive activity as well. So, we have to hold true that multiple things are going to be happening at the same time. In states like Oregon, which has some of the most progressive voting rights laws in the country, it is politically possible there to expand the vote to people sentenced to secure facilities, to people sentenced to prison. At the same time, in a state like Texas, where 300,000 people are disenfranchised living in the community on felony probation and parole, that state is actively working to make it harder, even for people who are legally eligible in custody. There's actual pending legislation in Texas this year to make it illegal to have jails as a polling location. That's in a voter suppressive bill that's making its way through the Texas legislature. So this is a big country. The states are laboratories of democracy and policy. Multiple things are going to be happening at the same time. There literally will be two Americas when it comes to democracy. Some jurisdictions, some states will make it easy to vote, including for those regardless of their incarceration status. Other states are going to make it more challenging to vote. And I think the movement has to be ready to hold two things true and to be working to protect democracy.
This has been an area where I've hoped that federally we had some assistance as a model. There's been talk over the years of re-enfranchising anyone federally. And so that they could have access to the vote federally and be able to at least vote in gubernatorial elections, if not in their own particular state. And obviously that's not enough. But I think this is a place where we should be requesting some leadership on the federal level. Not that every state, I think we're still gonna have those challenges in these stubborn states. However, you know, I think that's one thing that certainly could help.
So I sort of agree with that, right? That's at least if we did get some federal leadership, it makes a huge difference. When I think about, when you talk about Oregon, right? There was a lot of change going on there because of what I call the great state of Portland. And that's similar to, for example, New York, right? If it were not for New York City, I don't think that New York State would be in the position that it is. So I guess where I want to land is being really strategic about those states where you have that critical mass, right? Where we can get some progress and just push hard.
And I want to be clear, was the question about people who are currently incarcerated voting?
So some states, so the question was basically that some states are saying that you're banned from voting while incarcerated, but then you're automatically restored upon your release. And, you know, so the thought is, do you think that could address, you know, what's happening here? Or should we be looking towards the Maine and Vermont model where you never lose your right to vote despite being incarcerated? So either way.
Yes. So ideally, you would never lose, in a perfect world to me, you would never lose your right to vote when you get convicted of a felony offense. I saw that in Georgia, you're automatically restored. That's fairly recent. I think that anything that would get us closer to having more people voting is a step in the right direction. And however we get there, and I don't know, I think Tennessee is probably gonna be last or next to last. So there's probably going to have to be something that comes down from the federal government or the Supreme Court to really get us to move where we need to move. But I still have hope that it can happen. But I think in this state in particular, it's gonna have to come from somewhere else.
And it also might have to happen incrementally, right? So if we just run with the disproportionate impact on the Black and poor, the least Tennessee could do is take the legal financial obligations piece out, right? So that it's at least a clear path to get there that's possible. And so I just want to underscore our extremely restrictive laws because you know, I don't know if we're going to get movement on the disenfranchisement issue anytime soon, but if we just look at disproportionate impact, we should at least be able to reach across the aisle in that respect and just say it's just really unfair to hold the right to vote hostage with fees that people are never going to be able to afford.
Do you think that's possible?
I think it's more possible than, than voter rights generally.
Or
And we've had some progress with legal financial obligations in some other areas, but even child support, right?
Right, that's what I was
Because
gonna
even
say.
child support here can be a legal obligation that has to be satisfied. Any arrears in child support have to be satisfied before voting rights are restored. And how are you supposed to pay child support when you've been in prison? How? Or in jail for an extended period of time. So not in addition to the legal financial obligations with the court and with the state, I also gotta go and satisfy child support. And maybe one of the reasons why I have to pay child support is because of systemic issues that I need to vote about in the first place.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Can I just say that I know that Maryland, U.S. Senator Ben Cardin is planning to reintroduce the Democracy Restoration Act, which you referenced, and that federal bill would allow for voting in federal elections in every state across the country after incarceration, so that's people lifetime disenfranchised or continuing to be disenfranchised post-sentence because of those legal financial obligations here in Tennessee and other lifetime disenfranchising states like Kentucky and Virginia. And we estimate, because of the number of people who would be impacted with a felony, probation sentence, a parole sentence, and post-sentence, that about 3.5 million people would get their votes back if that congressional bill were to pass. I think obviously the political prospects in Congress are probably no better than they are in Tennessee, but I think it gives people something to look at and organize around. And I think in politically challenging states, probably building up grassroots advocacy, grassroots support, even if the goal is a long-term conversation, long-term strategy that hopefully can help motivate those civic engagement conversations that are happening at the local area.
So I want to take a piece of that and pivot before we go to our final question, because of course we cannot step away from this panel without talking about the Tennessee 3 and what impact that might have in terms of voter engagement as well as voter suppression, not only within the returning citizen community, but also within, disaffected voters, much like we mentioned earlier, that voter apathy of, well, my vote doesn't count. So when you see somebody that you voted for be basically kicked out of office, what impact do you think that's going to have on the voting movement as a whole, and is that going to make the work more difficult to bring returning citizens into the fold, back into the fold, those who are eligible to be able to register to vote again?
Let's be clear, all of our democracies are under attack. It's not just voting, it's reproductive rights. It's our duly elected officials, right? And I think the other thing that we need to think about here is this depression on civic engagement in poor Black communities. So if it's not a habit, if it's not a spirit of the community to be capable to get out there and vote, it doesn't become a part of the culture. And that is the most damaging thing, that you got 1/3 of communities who can't vote, who never get to experience that, and don't get to come back and carry that knowledge to their families. When one person in the family can't vote, that impacts the entire family. And not just because, and in some really sadistic ways, right? I have cousins who are felonized, like I said, a crime family, right? That just believe that it's all BS because of it, right? And to some extent, I have to agree. And then I have to have that conversation. And so that impacts the whole idea around voting. When none of my cousins can vote, it's not a practice in my family outside of my household. It's not. As much as I talk about it, as much as I preach about it, it does not become a part of the culture and people can't do it. And so that is the most damaging thing about this. And so when we start talking about things like the other threats to our democracy and removing our elected officials, what we're also talking about is creating a culture and sustaining a culture where people really feel like their voice does not matter. And honestly, to our legislature, it doesn't. And so unless we can change the narrative in a way that makes it believable in these communities, right? And you can't change that narrative if you're disenfranchising 1/3 of the population and taking away their duly elected officials.
So I think, I'm not gonna shy away from working in places where it's possible politically to expand the vote. And I think that has to happen in order to protect our democracy, building out an electorate, and then establishing practices, norms that guarantee valid access for those who are legally eligible, including those regardless of incarceration status. And I think because of states like Tennessee, because of states like my home state of Texas, we have to organize civic engagement infrastructure outside of voting because of this backlash era that we're in. So I'm really looking at ways to partner with people, to collaborate with people, to learn around what does that look like? What does a civic engagement infrastructure look like in states where voter suppression is being rooted, and where people are literally at risk of trying to participate in formal democratic institutions through voting and other institutions like the Tennessee Free. So I think that's something for us to continue to think about together and build out, but I think those are two conversations that need to be happening at the same time.
I live in Justin Pearson's district, District 86. As a matter of fact, we're in District 86 right now. So I think that I can see where people may have thought, what difference does it make? They're gonna silence us anyway. They're gonna disrespect us on the legislative floor anyway. They're not gonna listen to us. We'll have to resort to bullhorns in order for our voices to be heard. But that's why I think it was so important for our county commission to reappoint him in Nashville, for them to be reappointed immediately, because there were threats to withhold funds and do other things if they were reappointed. But I can see someone feeling like, why vote if this is the outcome, if I don't have representation anyway? But I don't think that tactic worked this time. I think it had the opposite effect this time. So I'm hopeful.
And I guess I want to pick up on exactly that point, right? Where I hope these types of actions has those unintended consequences, that it gets people angry, right? And we do exactly, not just put them back in office, right? That becomes a flashpoint for the community to start rallying around, and it actually gets people more engaged.
And so my final question before I turn it to the audience for their questions, call to action. What can attorneys, community members, people who believe in this cause, give one or two things that we can do walking out of this room to be able to fight for more access to voting, for returning citizens to be able to have their voices be heard, and to be able to try and make some positive change in this arena.
Since we're speaking to lawyers, I think that lawyers should educate themselves on the voting restoration process in your state. And when you have clients who have felony convictions, you should let them know, when you're ready to get your voting rights restored, when you're eligible, I will help you, I will walk you through the process. I think that's one thing that lawyers can do.
So I agree with that, and I also think that lawyers should really partner with the individuals who are most impacted, right? And that's justice involved individuals. And try to use our legal podium and bullhorn to amplify their voices.
I think that whatever authority or whatever influence lawyers can do to help their clients not actually get that felony conviction. So obviously winning the case, but also if they're in the outcome of the case to prevent that felony. That is not a process or an outcome that should be dismissed or minimized, given the collateral impacts, including loss of voting rights, but also legally discriminated against in housing and employment and a range of other collateral impacts. So that defelonization conversation and in representation matters of lawyers can help prevent their clients from getting felonies. And in states, we're reclassifying felonies to lower offenses. So these are laws that have been adopted in a handful of states, including California, Oklahoma. So that probably opens up new practices for attorneys to work with clients at reclassification of offenses. And I'll just lastly say that there's a range of other reforms, right, that pass prospectively. If entrepreneurial attorneys can help open up case law for that retroactive reconsideration so that clients with those prior case histories can be reclassified again or can receive some expungement or some other offense relief, then that too can help address that felonization and minimize or erase those collateral consequences that attach to the conviction.
So I would say tap into your organizations as you uniquely can. I'm at the law school here in Memphis, and one thing that we've been doing is trying to build our educational arsenal for the public. My dean earlier mentioned the Center for Excellence in Decision Making, and one component of that center that we hope to launch next year is to do a series of Know Your Rights kind of public education that would be public facing, and not just for people to come into our building, but for us to go into the communities and do that work so that people are better informed of their rights. And the other thing that I think we've been doing is an expungement, kind of gearing up for an expungement clinic. So that's something that these are things that we have manpower, we have the knowledge and those kinds of things within the law school. We're uniquely poised to provide those free legal services and also that kind of education. But all of you are part of organizations that have some kind of power, and they all have some kind of niche and and there's a way that you can uniquely contribute. And so I would recommend exploring how your respective organizations can get in on the fights towards democracy.
Great, thank you for that. We have about time for maybe 2 audience questions, because I know we have our election afterwards. So questions from the audience? Okay, all right, we'll start in the back and then I'm moving forward. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, well, this is a terrific panel, very well done. I practice in Tampa, as you know, and I represent one of the 5 people in my circuit who were charged last summer by the governor's election broadcasters. But here's the practical reality. Okay? I'm the last guy standing. My client's the last one standing. 3 of them, 4 were represented by private counsel, all of us doing pro bono. The defender's office represented 1 individual who went to trial, was acquitted on 1 count, convicted on 1 count. I attended the sentencing. The judge gave that individual 2 years of probation with no early termination and a couple $1,000s in fines and costs. The prosecutor offered 3 of the individuals 6 months probation if they entered a plea with early termination after 3 months, and waived fines and costs except the statutory costs that they can't waive. Those individuals pled. All of these people have been to Florida State Prison, some of them for decades. Obviously, they don't want to go back to Florida State Prison, right? So they're being offered 3 months probation, in essence. My client is elderly, poor health. He doesn't know what he wants to do. I'm advising him, we're litigating it, but the practical reality is he's thinking, do I want to go back to Florida State Prison? No. And it's political theater. It's outrageous. To Wade's point about getting angry, I mean, I'm angry about our governor's attack on reproductive rights, our governor's attack on the LGBTQ community, on voter suppression. I'm happy to be involved in a pro bono basis. I'm frustrated because it's just political theater from him, our governor, to talk about what he says is rampant voter fraud in our state. And in the last full election cycle, there were 2 voting issues, both in the villages, from out-of-state people that had second homes in the villages and apparently voted twice, right? And they were given 1 day of a diversion program. So, any thoughts on how we approach this? I mean, I've been following, and obviously we, as you know, Judge Hirsch, when he entered the order for the first case in Dade County, dismissing that case on the basis that the statewide prosecutor didn't have jurisdiction because it wasn't a statewide issue. But then they pivoted, and in my circuit, we have a Sanus appointed state attorney who he appointed after he removed a progressive state attorney, Andrew Warren. And she has said she is prosecuting these cases will have her prosecutors cross-designated, and they're going to seek the maximum. So, I'm just throwing it out there for just the practical reality of advising a client who has been before the state prison and obviously doesn't want to go back. And is evaluating, do I take this offer even though I don't think I did anything wrong? I was told I could vote. I said, I'm not eligible. They said, yes, you are.
So I think, so thank you for that, Kevin, and thank you for your work on this. So I think the underlying question is, what do you tell somebody who is staring down the barrel of a prison sentence, a potential prison sentence, for something they felt that they didn't do? Do you tell them to stick it out and fight, or do you tell them to, take the 3 months and run?
I mean, so I wonder what is an opportunity for litigation in this case? So your client, there might be a practical decision that your client makes in the short run, but is there an opportunity for strategic or impact litigation that could hopefully give a remedy to some of these people that got caught up under the DeSantis prosecutions? And so maybe whatever decision your client is facing now will keep them out of prison. But if there's an impact litigation case, maybe it can help reverse some of these convictions so that in the long run, this disparate treatment, I mean, it sounds like there's disparate outcomes based on counties, and so maybe there's like an ongoing impact litigation case that's possible.
There is disparate outcomes depending on the county, and not on anywhere else depending upon the judge. I'm in front of a very conservative, tough on, law and order, DeSantis appointed judge. I want to try the case. Ultimately, it's my client's decision with my counsel. But, and I wouldn't blame him for faulting at all if he said, I don't want to go back to prison. It's not, I'm not well, serious health issues.
Let's be realistic. We're talking about a population of people who have hardships. And so asking them to put these rights on their back is asking a lot, and it's asking too much for most people. So I hate to be the person to say you have to just honor what that client wants to do, but this is an old gentleman and he just doesn't have that fight in him. I think you have to be understanding of that. I think that's a lot to ask of an individual who's gone through what they go through, and I would be encouraged to take on litigation, but it has to be the right client to do that. And sometimes it isn't worth it for an individual. So that's a hard situation, but I think it has to be a good alignment with the particular client to pursue that. And for some people, it's just too much of a hardship.
I mean, in the others example, for example, the three who pled to the offer of 3 months probation, 2 of them had done over 10 or 15 years in Florida State prison. They've been out of it. They just want to be done. They just want to be done. Yeah. They don't want to run the risk of doing that. Nobody's faulting them or the lawyers from, it's a frustrating situation, and they want to try. That judge had sentencing said, Mr. So-and-so, you were convicted of one count, you were jury not guilty of one count 2. I'm giving you 2 years of probation with no early termination, and I just want you to know that you have been convicted of the second count. I would have sent you to Florida State Prison. So that's in the newspaper, and the clients see that, and they say, this is what I'm facing if I'm convicted.
Okay, so unfortunately, I just want to get to the Rev, because I know Reverend had a question, and I know you had a question in front. Rev, if you can address your question, and then we can have you, the third question, we can come up and talk about it.
Shout out to Up About 901.
I promise I'll be brief. Number one, I appreciate you coming to the special. Number two, I think, to Brother McKenzie's point, it is about the issue of litigation, and I think that's where we've been lacking. I think there's a lot of activism on the ground, but not enough litigation to back it up and beat it up. So I'm asking first to my sisters, Turner and Frank, can we craft something locally that, because we've been part of Lost don't litigate and advance something called the restoration and expansion of voting rights and access, because we just need to push it a lot further. And then secondly, to everybody, and what kind of resources are out there for organizations who are willing to engage in the litigation, but don't have financial wherewithal to sustain them, because we know that a lot of these things get kicked down the road over and over again. But we're here for the long fight. So, first, it's got to be friend, and that's why I turned. Hey, let's scrap it. I sent y'all a text message, so we can work on that. But moreover,
Talk about a call to action.
yes,
right?
yes, exactly what I'm trying to do. But then also to everybody, like, what kind of resources are out there that we can possibly tap into? Because if this gonna be a 4-year, 5-year, 10-year battle, then some of us gotta have some support, some financial support.
So rapid fire. Because I'm getting the.
Let's talk, I've been talking to some other organizations about this.
So, yes, we can litigate these issues. Voting rights issues have been litigated in the state of Tennessee for, ever. We just have to find the cases that we feel like are good cases, the clients that want to go through the process. Like I said, a lot of people who have been to prison, been involved in the system, don't want to be involved in it anymore. And they know that there are consequences, there are repercussions, there is backlash when you go up against governments. So yes, these issues can be litigated. As far as resources, it's usually volunteers that do a lot of the work. Volunteer lawyers, volunteer organizations, and perhaps there's funding, but we can look into that, but it's usually volunteers, people who are doing it because they feel like it's the right thing to do.
So thank you for that. So unfortunately, our time together is over. I hope that the panelists can stay a couple more minutes off to the side to be able to address any remaining questions. But I'd like to first of all thank each and every one of the panelists